So let's now move on into step number one. Why do we even talk about siblings? Why is that important? There are many, many relationships that children have. What is it about the sibling relationship that requires much, much more attention than we've given it up to this point? So when you look at research on family dynamics, clinical work on family dynamics, very little is done as it relates to siblings. And I'm going to share with you in a little while that even legally, we don't really talk much about siblings. And we'll talk about them in a minute. So let's run through quick little vignettes of the importance of sibling, and then we'll bring it back. So first of all, let me introduce you, as part of the beginning of our journey into siblings, to Elliot. Elliot over here is with his children, Paul, Eleanor, and Elliot Jr. Elliot had a very rivalrous relationship with his older brother, Ted. Throughout high school, Ted was about 2 years older than him, and Elliot and Ted had a profoundly rivalrous relationship. Now, during high school, Elliot was doing better than his older brother, Ted. But after high school, Ted really took off. And that got to Elliot in a very, very disturbing way. And after a while, the sibling relationship, that rivalry got to him to a degree where he started drinking and he developed alcoholism. And at the age of 34, Elliot attempted suicide by jumping from a second floor, and he survived the suicide, but a few days later he had a seizure as a result of the suicide, and he passed away, leaving children and family. His older brother ended up having a phenomenal career, and he ended up becoming our 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt. This is Elliot Roosevelt. And that sibling relationship had a profound and negative impact on his life. That's number one. This guy you may have remembered, right? Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, otherwise known as the Boston Marathon bomber. As the story unfolded after that tragic day at the finish line of that Boston Marathon, it came out, and now supposedly the defense is going to run with this, that he was just a player. He was played by his older brother, Tamerlan. And it was the older brother who became radicalized. And it was the older brother that impacted and influenced this younger honor student to join him in this evil scheme. And that's how he got involved with this entire tragic conclusion. So once again, the sibling bond, the sibling relationship could have such detrimental outcomes. Let's look at some of the positives, now that I've depressed you enough. We're about to commemorate 50 years to the shooting of JFK. And here you have a relationship that was clearly a rivalry, but it was a rivalry that was used in a very different way. They used the rivalry for remarkable, remarkable things. Who knows what would have been with Bobby if he would not have been assassinated? Who knows what a remarkable president he would have been? And Teddy, the amount of work he did for mental health reasons, for mental health purposes, also remarkable. So here you have a sibling bond, a rivalry that wasn't taken off to the deep end. And they clearly were rivalrous. When you see the old footage of them playing football on the beaches of Hyannisport, they clearly were rivalrous. When you read about the accounts of their father, Joe, and the pressure he put on his kids, and he encouraged that rivalry, but somehow they worked through the rivalry, and they became better people through that process. What's really the secret of this? One of the things we're going to deal with today. And finally, one more interesting story, one most dear to me. John and Jim Harbaugh, right? Our Baltimore Ravens Super Bowl champs. Go Ravens, right? We're trying to milk the beauty of last season because this season's not working very well, right? Here you can't get a greater rivalry than playing against each other in the Super Bowl. You cannot have scripted this any better. And when this actually happened, the week in the lead up to the Super Bowl, I must have been on the radio, I don't know, 5-10 times, talking about the sibling relationship and what are my views and what we know about siblings in terms of the research and how that applies to the story. So it was really a great ride. And then after the game also there was a lot to learn from them. But the point over here is that even though they had such a rivalry, and when you look at their histories, and I had a chance to research them when this came up and I needed to read up on their lives, they were rivalrous throughout their college career and coaching career, some in college, some in the NFL, and somehow they were able to take this rivalry, profound rivalry, and end up like this. The game ended, and I called this a hug when I wrote about this, but it wasn't really a full hug, but I was trying to analyze it. Can I call it a hug to really confirm what I should be saying about it? But let's call it a hug. And regardless of this picture, stories that come out of these brothers, really beautiful stories. Really beautiful stories. And we're going to get back to their relationship specifically in a little while when we talk about, well, what are the secrets? What are parents doing to make this happen? Okay? But let me add a little bit more in terms of what we know about siblings and how profoundly crucial they are in our lives and what we could eventually do with them. Let's look at a couple of components. First of all, over 90% of Americans have some kind of sibling. Over 90% have some kind of sibling. So be it a full sibling, a half a sibling, a step sibling, an adopted sibling. Over 90%. And just for a quick little unscientific study, raise your hand if you have some kind of sibling. Half, quarter, right? This is pretty nice. Look around. This is 90%, more than 90%, right? So it's a relationship that the large majority of us in the Western world have, and these statistics are coming from the United States, as most statistics in this field, and it's a relationship that we all have. And again, we're not talking about it enough. Number two, it is the most long-lasting relationship. Think about all the relationships that we have with our spouse, significant other. It developed a little later in life. It lasts for 50, 60 years if you're lucky. That's that relationship. What about with our parents? Right? They have us when they're in their 30s on average. How long do we have from that relationship? 50 years if we're lucky. What about our children? Also, right? About 50 years. The sibling relationship is the longest relationship we could have. Very often, on average, it happens when the child is 2, 3, 4 years old. And it can last 80 years. It's an 80-year relationship. The longest relationship you could possibly have. And again, we're not talking about it enough. We're not applying it enough. But I'll add even more, and more importantly, okay? When siblings get along with each other, when siblings have that closeness, it offers multiple psychological benefits, including buffering and compensation. Let me explain to you buffering and compensation. First of all, beyond the buffering and compensation, studies overwhelmingly show. When I say overwhelmingly, it's not overwhelming in comparison to studies on other relationships in the social network. But the studies that do exist out there show us that children who have that closeness deal with childhood in a much easier way. They have higher self-esteem, less loneliness, better academic achievement. When they hit adolescence, they're able to deal with the adolescent storm and stress in a more helpful and healthy way. When they hit adulthood and they have job difficulties or marital difficulties, those with a close sibling relationship deal with those difficulties in a much healthier way. And then even more, once you hit the golden years and you transition into senior citizenship, studies show that successful aging is linked to healthy relationship with siblings. Those who have had a close relationship with siblings throughout life, they hit the older years in a much healthier way. They have that sense of support. So in essence, when we as clinicians, or those who work with families, or parents, work on the sibling bond when the kids are young, you're giving them a lifelong gift. You can't, it's better than any iPhone or laptop that my kids are insisting I buy them now, and I'm trying to convince them that no, we're going to work on the sibling relationship. They're not buying it now. They're not buying it at this point, but we're hoping that eventually, and they will. They will, because I know how it is with my family. My parents really emphasized, we're 4 brothers and a younger sister, and my parents emphasized that sibling bond, and when we were young, we I'm not going to tell you what we did to each other, but we definitely were not a harmonious kind of group. But we had a lot of positive components to it. My parents, again, worked on it very, very heavily. And now we're adults, and they are truly my closest support providers. And I hope my wife doesn't watch this video, but they clearly are my closest support providers. We're constantly in contact. We're doing similar kind of work, and it's quite remarkable. Okay, let's talk about those two words, buffering and compensation. The term buffering in psychological literature refers to when someone is in a life circumstance, a neighborhood environment, some kind of community that's offering, unfortunately, some kind of negative outcomes, otherwise known as children and youth at risk. Studies show that when you have a close sibling bond, that bond could buffer against the naturally occurring negative outcomes of growing up at risk. So, and this has been done in many different kinds of at-risk situations. Neighborhood risk, family risk, divorce, foster home placement. Once again, children with a close sibling bond deal with those negative aspects, with those potentially destructive components in a much healthier way. And they deal with it with less depression, less loneliness, higher self-esteem, higher life satisfaction, elevated level of happiness. So once again, the sibling bond is a buffer against these negative outcomes. And then you have compensation. What happens when other relationships are not offering the support that they should? Kids who don't necessarily have such good friends, or they don't necessarily have a strong and healthy relationship with their parents. Under certain circumstances, and we could talk about this for an hour, what are those circumstances, but under certain circumstances, the sibling bond can compensate for the negative relationships that exist in these other aspects of life. So once again, a highly, highly crucial relationship. And the bottom line, where do we learn about how to engage other people? Where do we learn about how to interact with other people? Where do we learn about how to be friends? How to be coworkers? How to be spouses? Where do we learn that? We learn that early on in life with our siblings. The sibling relationship is that first relationship that you have with a peer, right? Parents have one set of rules in the way they govern their home. It's my way or the highway, even though my 13-year-old doesn't like when we say that, but it's my way. And you know what? Kids need to hear that. Kids, every once in a while, my daughter recently is complaining that we have this whole homework system with her now. And she has to check things off. And I'm 13, I shouldn't be have to checking things off anymore. I'm independent. So I asked her, so why are you doing it? Well, I hate it. Okay, but why are you doing it? Because you told me to. That's great. That's it. You know what? The bottom line is, every once in a while, children need to do something because my parents told me so. But what about democracy? What about, yes, there's a room for it, for sure. But we're doing a little bit too much of that. And we have to sometimes pull back a little bit. And yes, it's important. This is coming from the work of Piaget. We don't really think about Piaget in terms of social relationships. But yes, Piaget wrote even about social relationships. Children need that authority figure. Because when they grow up, guess what? They're going to be authority figures telling them what to do and what not to do. That assess this, where families back in once you hit adulthood, and it lasts for many, many, many years. That's an interesting first finding that you see. But let me share with you a few other oddball findings that we have found. And again, it's a beautiful way of measuring the sibling relationship, because then you look at this and you can have some interesting determinations about what's going on with siblings if you do this with a child and an adolescent. And their siblings don't exist in these circles. And you know that they have siblings. That's a red flag. And that's something for you to follow up with. Or if siblings are in circle number 1. And they're teenagers. That's, I don't know if it's a red flag, but it's definitely a flag. And you want to follow up on it because it's a powerful resource you can tap into. Let me share with you a few other interesting kind of findings about this. And then we'll move on to more of the sibling aspect of it. What we also find is that females, children, adolescents, and even in adulthood, have many more people in the network than males, which is an interesting, and again, there are many, many studies that confirm this, okay? So we don't really have a representative split of men and women in here, but if we theoretically would have, we could have done a quick little unscientific survey and clearly have found, based on a lot of, many, many years of research, that women have many more people in their social network. Okay, when I do this in college, when I do this in my classes, I have more of a split, and I very often do this. I have them write the number of people overall, and we do a quick little analysis, and overwhelmingly women have a larger, and there's a quicker, and when I do this in college, I use other terminology or methods, or I ask them, how many friends do you have on Facebook? Now, I know that's a whole other topic, but also, there are some studies that show that women are going to have more friends on Facebook than men. Or I have them all pull out their cell phone, and I ask them, how many contacts do you have in your cell phone book? And women overwhelmingly have more people on there. Guys usually have 2, and one is a pizza store. I don't know if that counts. That was not that was not a scientific analysis. Okay? But let me share with you 2 other fascinating findings. Another thing that studies have found is that sometimes children and adolescents place in their circles deceased relatives. What an unbelievable piece of information to have when you're working with a child. So how do we know, when you do this from a research perspective, and you can do this clinically as well, once you have all the names, because if I would look at your circles, I would only have a bunch of names. I wouldn't know who they are. So what you're supposed to do as part of the research protocol is now go to every single person and ask them, okay, who's this person? Meaning now that they wrote it, they're committed, now you can find out, okay, who these people are. And one by one, is there a family member? Do they live with you? Do they not? Is it a sibling? What kind? Friend? School friend? Neighborhood friend? You go to as part of the research protocol. And what we have found is you get to a name in circle 1, 2, or 3. Who is this person? It's my grandma. Oh, where does she live? She passed away 10 years ago. The child may have not even met her sometimes. Who are we to disagree with an 8-year-old who tells you that they are loved by a deceased relative? What a brilliant method, or what a brilliant follow-up, or something to note about something subsequently that you could use as part of the treatment by them bringing up such an unbelievable and personal piece of information. Another finding is that children and adolescents often place religious figures in these circles. Again, what an interesting finding. How would we have found this out without using this kind of measure? So there's such a wealth of information you get from using this kind of measure, right? My wife has warned me several times not to tell this story again, but I will tell it anyway. So I'm going to apologize up front about this story, but I think it is such a unique and personal story that I insist, and I overrule my wife on this one, and I say the story anyway. When I was in graduate school, we used this for my dissertation, right? So we had about a sample of about 700 kids in South Florida. I did my doctoral work in Florida. And what we had to do is we had to deal with the Dade County public school system. We went into the school system, and we would pull kids out of class, and we would sit with them quietly in the library somewhere. And we would do this, and there were several other measures that we threw in there as well. But I'm a graduate student. I go out of the university, I go to the local school over there, and I had, right, there was a whole system where we had to pull out specific kids. So I'm sitting with a 5th grader. I'm sitting with a 5th grader in some school in Miami, which I'm not going to mention here, some middle, like a elementary school in Miami. And I'm sitting with him and I'm doing the convoy model. And this child, this 5th grader, puts the word Jesus in the first circle. Very nice. Now, as I mentioned to you, part of the interview protocol is that I now have to go back to every single name and ask, as part of the research protocol, who is this person? Even though I may know who it is, I still have to do it as part of the interview protocol. What's ultimately going to impact this? What's going to ultimately decide if a rivalry leads to the story of the Roosevelts or leads to the story of the Harbaughs? What's going to really impact it? Studies are overwhelmingly showing us that the bottom line is it's about this. It's about family. And more specifically, it's about this person and this person. It is about mother and father. In this case, it's Jack and Jackie. And again, I had some time to research this family. Absolutely beautiful stories coming out of what this family did. Growing up and the support for one another. So there's something that families can do, parents can do, to truly impact the sibling relationship in profound ways. And that's what I want to spend the rest of our time on. What really can ultimately be done when we're working with families directly, or we are working with parents to try to use this as a regular sense of support, or very often as a buffer. We're very often dealing with families that don't have all the resources and unfortunately are at risk. Tapping into this gold mine, tapping into the sibling relationship early and teaching and partnering with parents to try to impact that relationship early, once again, is giving families a lifelong gift. So let's actually look at that. Let's look at relationship intervention. And it's very, very important to start off our discussion about relationship intervention by mentioning that very often people take this all about how do we minimize fighting between siblings. That has been the focus in the literature and clinical work. What do we do that they shouldn't fight? And what we're finding now is that that's the wrong approach. The approach should not be no conflict. Because you know what that means when there's no conflict? There's also no passion in the relationship. So it's not about minimizing conflict, right? You could lock two kids up in different rooms and there's absolutely no conflict, but there's no relationship. Just, you go to that room, you go to that room, don't talk to each other until you graduate. That's not encouraging the positive. Now let me share with you one of my favorite sibling stories that really highlight this dimension. And the truth is, this story is what started, this story happened many, many years ago that I observed. And this is ultimately what started me on this line of research about 15 years ago on siblings. Now, it helped that I had a close sibling bond with my brothers. But in terms of what really compelled me to start working on my dissertation on siblings was this story. While I was in graduate school, I worked weekends in a youth center. And the youth center was like a youth center / synagogue as a youth director. And my job was to organize youth programming. So during the week, whenever I had time, late at night after I was exhausted from graduate school, I would have to come up with some kind of clever programming for the kids. And then, on Saturday, I would give the teenagers packets. This is the plan for the hour. And they would have to apply it with kids, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-olds, through preteens. And that was my job. So one Saturday, I'm making my rounds, so I give them the packet early on, and I'm making my rounds to make sure that all the groups are running in a healthy kind of productive fashion. And suddenly a teenager runs up to me and says to me, "I need your help immediately." What happened? "Just come right now." So I follow her up the steps to where we had the classrooms on the second floor. And I walk into her room where she was instructing. And there are two kids on the floor punching each other. A 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, just smacking each other. Now, that wasn't the only problem. Number one is that they were siblings. The 4-year-old and the 5-year-old were siblings, and they were smacking each other hard. But even a bigger problem for me was that these two children were the rabbi's sons. What do I do now? So I tried to break it up, but it just was not working. It was not working. And I was going to call a SWAT team, but that was not it. So I decide, against all my mental faculties, to run downstairs into the main sanctuary and call the rabbi. So I run downstairs and I get up to the doors of the main sanctuary and I see him delivering his sermon. He's in the middle of his sermon. Now, you don't disturb a rabbi during his sermon. That's the 11th commandment. It was also in my contract. You don't. But then I looked around at the congregants and most of them were still up. So I knew that he was in the earlier stages of the sermon. So I decided to go in there and disturb the sermon. I was not going to let the bloodshed continue. And I walk in there and I walk down the aisle and I see people looking at me like, "What are you doing?" And I get up on stage and I whisper in the rabbi's ear, I'm sorry for disturbing you, but your two children got into a violent fight upstairs. I need your help now. So the rabbi begrudgingly ends his sermon, and he charges down the aisle out the door, and I'm following him, and the congregants are wondering what the heck is going on here. And he runs up the steps, and he charges into this room. And the fight was still in the middle. They were still in round one. And the next few seconds happened really in slow motion. And we're going to look at a few pieces. Number one, the importance of conveying to parents de-identification. Let me share with you what this word is. When children are compared to one another, at home, at school, in the neighborhood, they're more likely to fight. Oh, you're Stephanie's sister. I hate when people tell me that, right? You have often, very often people report this as an annoyance about siblings, where you're constantly being compared to the other one. What parents need to do is de-identify them. Let them each develop their own sense of identity, especially during the teenage years. Meaning, if you know that one is good at something, highlight that. Don't insist that they both do tennis, and they both do ballet, and they both dress the same, and they, right? All these subtle things that we do with kids, where we're basically saying, hey, you're the same, so if I'm like somebody, I'm much more likely to get angry at them. Whereas if I de-identify them, you're letting them be individuals and appreciate the other's uniqueness. And this happens not only at home, by the way. Schools do this very often. I remember this like it happened 25 years ago. When I was in school in 7th grade, I was in 7th grade, and it's the first day of class in science class in 7th grade. And the teacher's doing a roll call. Now, my older brother, who's 7 years older than me, was in that same school, in this guy's class, 7 years before. My brother wasn't the best student, to say the least. I'm in his class 7 years later. He's going through roll call. He gets to my name, and he goes, Milevsky, I'm present. And this is exactly what he does. He looks, and he pauses, and he looks me in the eye, and he says, are you Moshe's brother? And I say, yes. And he responds like this. He looks at me and says, that's it. That little head nod and weird throatal noise. I knew at that moment that I will fail this class. And in fact, I failed that class. What did this teacher do? He merged me with my brother. He did not allow me to de-identify. Teachers do it so many times. We're basically shutting off the uniqueness of children by identifying them with an older sibling. So it's negative on so many dimensions, including very negative academic outcomes, where if that's what you expect from me, that's what I'm going to give you. We call it a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we need to be very careful as people who work with families and parents. De-identify your children. Number 2, parental favoritism. That's a big one. That's a big one. When you talk to children about what most irks you in your relationship within the family, it's, well, my mother favors my sibling, my brother, my sister, my father does. This is constantly reported by children and adolescents as an issue. We have to be very careful with that as parents. And what do we do about it? We talk about it. You cannot, the bottom line is, bring out some kind of atomic measurement device when you're slicing cake after dinner. It's not going to happen. Some kids are going to get a bigger piece of cake. It's going to happen. Try to measure it, and that's not the way to approach it. Try to give them identical, that's not the way to approach it. Well, if I got something for you, I have to get something for you, but it's not my birthday. It doesn't make a difference. You get a gift because I gave them a gift, and if you're going to be jealous, but it's not my birthday, it's their birthday. I don't care, don't say that. Here's a gift for you, and that's it. That's an obsession. That's unhealthy. The way we deal with it is that we talk it out with our kids. When our kids come to us with a complaint about it, you don't brush it out by saying that's not true, which is very often what we do. We say, let's talk about this. Why do you think she got a new backpack this summer? Well, because her old one was ripped. Yes, and what about yours? Mine is not ripped. So that's why I got her a backpack. Oh, talk it through. Because 90% of the time, that's the fact. That there's a reason why they got something you didn't. Now, there's a 10% is because you really like one versus the other. But we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about that. That's a whole other dimension. Importance of modeling, as we're saying. Positive engagement, emotional training, how do you approach intervention is an important thing. And I think most importantly is that we have to understand that parenting is a long-distance marathon. You're not going to do this in 1 week and see major changes. You may see some minor things, but the goal is to produce a beautiful relationship that will truly be a lifelong gift. Thank you very much. Let me just end. Let me just take 30 more seconds from your lunchtime. My book is going to be available for sale outside. The book was written primarily for clinicians, for people who work with families. It's not a parenting kind of easy read with all these cool little examples for parents. It's more for people who work with families to actually help them engage siblings more effectively. So it's specifically for clinicians, social workers, social service providers. In terms of that, it's available everywhere. Apparently, I just got an email recently that in Iran, the book is not available. So, it's available. I just got a recent email from Iran, so I just found that to be interesting. But it will be available outside. And also, if you want to hear more information about some of my work, I have a blog column on Psychology Today about sibling dynamics and parenting, Huffington Post, continuous blog about parent issues, parenting suggestions, sibling suggestions. You have my email there as well. Feel free to reach out. Continued success with the remarkable things you're doing with our families. Thank you.
I let other people come in because I've heard you before, so I'm still sorry I missed all of that. I will let you know I have Googled him, and there's some great stuff on the. I've done the Huffington Post. I haven't done the Psychology Today. Some great articles that you could actually use with your families. They're very down to earth, some very interesting things. And it's not always that. He's gone on and done some really other things that, regarding relationships. So I recommend that. But thank you again very much. I hate to cut it off, but we do only have a short period of time for lunch, and I got to get all of you guys through the lunch line.